It's no secret that there's a lot of Greek mythology going around right now. And maybe you've started out with some Greek mythology retellings, like the Song of Achilles, Jennifer Saint's Electra, The Women of Troy. I don't own Natalie Haynes, which she comes highly recommended as well. There was a new Clytemnestra novel that I've yet to read, so no comment here. And Anne Carson, who writes these sort of inspired and very creative novels. You might have also come into Greek mythology through an interest, like me, from The Secret History down a chart. Once you start digging in, you learn that there's a lot more, and you're kind of like, where do I start? Maybe you start with some of the plays, like Medea and the Bacchae. The Bacchae is a good starting point if you started with The Secret History, by the way. Maybe you also, like me, grew up reading the myths or having them read to you. My mom had this little pocket-sized edition of the Greek myths by this woman named Edith Hamilton. Maybe you're into the history, and so you read Thucydides. And then there's the big adventure stories. There's the Argo story, the Iliad, probably the one that is the best known, the Odyssey. And today I want to tell you a little bit about the Odyssey itself. I think you should read it. It's accessible, it's magical, and it's going to change how you read Greek mythology, and it's also sort of the foundational piece. It's Homer. Homer's was meant to be spoken and sung, so the challenge is finding a good translation that is meant to be spoken and sung, and that's why I recommend this one by Emily Wilson. She is a professor of classical studies at the University of Pennsylvania. There's a few things I like about this translation. One is that it's in iambic pentameter, so it sounds like English. It sounds, and when I will read a little bit later, and you'll hear some of that. Emily Wilson uses a very vernacular, like normal tone, so the words that I'm saying right now, it's not like dressed up like we find that sometimes like Shakespeare sounds to us, or sometimes older translations because they want to sound older, like make the language really hard for modern day 21st century ears. Nothing like that. And the third thing I like about this book is that it actually has really helpful summaries in the back. So if you just read something and you're like, I don't really understand what happened, always just reorient yourself. I don't think you'll need to do that because the Odyssey is actually pretty easy to read. So let's talk about that, the structure. There are 24 books in the Odyssey, 24 books, 24 chapters. You can think of them as like long epic poems. Each is, I want to say over 1,000 lines, but under 2,000 lines. So they're not too long. You can easily read one chapter aloud every night before going to bed and finish the whole thing in a month. The first 4 books are what's known as the Telemachy. They follow Odysseus' son, Telemachus. The books 5 through 13, more or less, are kind of what we traditionally associate with the Odyssey, so like the grand adventure stories, the Odysseus getting lost at sea, the sirens, the witch Kirky, the magical bag, the Cyclops. Like this is sort of the core Odyssey experience. The final chapters, the final 10 chapters, chapters 14 through 24, are going to be about Odysseus once he's home. And once he's home, he finds that his wife, Penelope, who does not get enough credit for single-handedly ruling Ithaca for 20 years, and also, homegirl had all of these hot young men throwing themselves at her for power, sure. But she resisted all of them and does not get enough credit. So that's Penelope. But he goes back to find Penelope has been keeping these men at bay, and they've basically been squatting on his land for 20 years, or 10 years, for too long to be squatting. So what does he do? And how does he get rid of them? And how does he, now that he's come home, he sort of has to take his home back. So that's the Odyssey. There are really 3 characters you need to know about: Telemachus, Penelope, and Odysseus. So not too much. And think of it like a high fantasy or an adventure fantasy book. So if you ever read the Redwell books or Game of Thrones or The Long Ships or really anything with ships and sea monsters and magic, then this should be right up your alley. And just to tell you, sort of give you an idea of how easy this is, I just want to read you the first little page here of the first book. Tell me about a complicated man, Muse. Tell me how he wandered and was lost when he had wrecked the holy town of Troy, and where he went and who he met, the pain he suffered in the storms at sea, and how he worked to save his life and bring his men back home. He failed to keep them safe, poor fools. They ate the sun god's cattle, and the god kept them from home. Now, goddess, child of Zeus, tell the old story for our modern times. Find the beginning. All the other Greeks who had survived the brutal sack of Troy sailed safely home to their own wives, except this man alone. Calypso, a great goddess, had trapped him in her cave. She wanted him to be her husband. When the year rolled round in which the gods decreed he should go home to Ithaca, his troubles still went on. So pretty easy, right? Give it a try. Some of the things I love about the Odyssey and some of my favorite I guess scenes or images from it are, one, I love the scene with the witch Kirke, which Madeline Miller, who wrote the Song of Achilles here, actually turned into an entire novel. It's called Kirkes or Circe. I don't know how people pronounce it. In Greek, it has the kappa, so it's Kirke. But Circe or Circe or Kersey or however you say it. I love the imagery in this story about, Dawn's rosy fingers sort of coming up like the rising sun. I love the adventure. I love the imagination of the sirens, of the clashing rocks, of, sailing to the underworld, of the imagination of the sun god. Kind of, there's an island at the far ends of the world that the sun god goes to rest, and that's where the sun sets, and he has these golden cattle there. One of the other things about the Odyssey is that once you have it, once you've read it, you sort of get a lot of the foundational references that come from some of the other books that maybe brought you to the Greeks in the first place. Odysseus appears in the Song of Achilles, so you get to understand him a bit more. If you're a Donna Tartt fan, there's a lot of the way in which they talk about Homer, and then a lot of the references that Tartt makes will no longer go over your head. You'll understand them a lot better. Clytemnestra here, her husband was Agamemnon, who kind of started the war that Odysseus is coming home from, so this is contemporary to the Odyssey. The Women of Troy, again, takes place during the Odyssey. It's such a foundational text because Homer came before pretty much everything else we have about the Greeks, or at least everything else that's written down. Everybody knew Homer. Everybody knew the story of the Odyssey. Everybody knew the story of Odysseus slaying the suitors on the beach. These stories were really as old as time, and there's some interesting things that you can go and you can see in there once you start to dig in a little bit deeper. We've been able to date the events of the Trojan War based on the text of the Odyssey. So here's how it works. It's really cool. You know how all of our modern planets are named after Roman gods, right? Jupiter, or like Mercury, or Venus. Those Roman names actually come from the Greek names. So Jupiter is Zeus, Mercury is Hermes, Venus is Aphrodite. And in the Odyssey, the gods do a lot of moving. What astronomers did, is they read the Odyssey and they sort of charted out the movements of the gods on the map. So for example, when Hermes moves around in the Odyssey from place to place to tell things to Odysseus, they tracked his movements and noted when Mercury would be in those places during like the time periods that we think the Trojan War happened. And so with all of this, we were pretty much able to date the Trojan War to pretty close to when we think it actually happened and what lines up with the archaeological evidence of what we think Troy is. So obviously as a mythological retelling, that's what the Odyssey is, right? It was a story, it was a song, it was a song, it was a song, and it probably came from farther east than the Greeks. And then it made its way to the Greeks where it got written down, but it was probably composed independently and then sort of edited together. And because we have that history and that story that survived, it's not too crazy to say that there probably was a war. There probably was a Troy or an Iliad. That's where the Iliad comes from. And so this is really a history. It's a shared history of anybody who comes with or interacts with anything culturally, intellectually that came from the Middle East or the Western world. With that, I think it's old, it's ancient, it's important, and it's really easy to read, and it's fun. It's a really good time. So go ahead, read it, let me know what you think.